Hey guys, tonight we're going to sink into one of those very niche corners of history where royalty wasn't just dysfunctional, it was medically tragic, politically awkward, and honestly, a little bit absurd. So dim the lights, grab your blanket, and maybe a cup of something warm, because we're about to talk about a royal heir who literally spent his whole short life shut away in a gilded cage. Yes, you heard that right. Not metaphorically. Not like, oh, the golden cage of royalty. No, this prince, João Manuel of Portugal, actually lived like some fragile Victorian houseplant that couldn't be exposed to the elements. He was born sickly, raised in isolation, and became such a symbol of dynastic failure that his family basically wrapped him up like fine china and hid him from the world. And of course, this is the House of Aviz we're talking about, a dynasty that had more than its fair share of tragic heirs, early deaths, and awkward political marriages. Because why have a strong and healthy royal lineage when you can instead double down on cousin marriages and hereditary diseases? Now, before we tuck João Manuel into his little velvet-lined cage, let's drift back a bit. To set the stage, we need to peek at Portugal in the early 1500s. This was a country at the peak of its global power. Imagine Lisbon at the time, bustling with spices from India, gold from Africa, sugar from Brazil. Portuguese ships were basically the Ubers of the ocean, zipping around everywhere. And here's the thing about dynasties, all that power didn't mean much if the royal family couldn't produce a stable, healthy heir. And in Portugal's case, it seemed like the royal wombs just kept delivering fragile, sickly little heirs who couldn't quite make it. Enter João Manuel, born in 1537, the only surviving son of King João III of Portugal and his wife, Catherine of Austria. Which, yes, Austria. So you know what that means. More Habsburg genes in the pool. Because why not stir in some of that legendary Habsburg jaw and general medical fragility? From the very beginning, João Manuel was a disaster baby. He was weak, underweight, prone to illness, the kind of child who made every court physician's career and every wet nurse's patience wear thin. Some historians say he suffered from a mix of diabetes and genetic disorders, probably from all the inbreeding. Others think he may have had tuberculosis, which was the royal family's unofficial house guest for generations. Either way, this kid was never destined to run around playing sword fights with the other princes of Europe. So, what did the Portuguese court do? They decided to basically raise him in a bubble. Not the plastic kind, though honestly, if 16th century Portugal had plastic wrap, they probably would have mummified him in it, but a very literal cage of restrictions. João wasn't allowed to go outside, he wasn't allowed to mingle with commoners, he wasn't even allowed to join his siblings in normal play. Instead, he was sheltered, wrapped up, and essentially caged for his own protection. Which, in classic royal irony, probably made him even weaker. Now picture the scene, a frail little prince, pale as parchment, sitting in ornate chambers while courtiers whispered about whether he'd make it to adulthood. Everyone knew the future of Portugal depended on this one boy, and everyone also knew the odds were, let's say, not great. And here's the kicker. João Manuel wasn't just being raised in a cage, he was also being groomed to marry. Because dynasties never quit. No matter how fragile or doomed an heir looked, there was always a plan to marry them off to someone equally tragic in another royal court. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before João Manuel's short, sad marriage, let's float through his childhood. Imagine being told every day of your life that you're the hope of an empire, but also that you might drop dead at any moment. That's the vibe João grew up with. His father, João III of Portugal, was already exhausted by politics, illness, and the general mess of ruling an empire. His mother, Catherine, was, of course, a Habsburg, which meant she brought with her both the infamous jawline genes and a whole new batch of hereditary issues. The couple had 9 children. 9! And guess how many survived childhood? Just this one, João Manuel. So, no pressure, little buddy. You're the only heir left. Don't sneeze too hard. Naturally, this made João sort of holy relic to the Portuguese court. His survival became a national obsession. He was prayed over, guarded, and treated like a porcelain doll. And the thing about porcelain dolls is they're creepy, fragile, and not really designed for the chaos of real life. So, João spent his childhood in confinement. He was educated, of course, because he was the heir. Tutors came in, lessons were held, and he learned all the usual royal subjects: languages, theology, history, diplomacy. But while other boys his age might have been out riding horses or practicing military drills, João was likely curled up indoors battling one illness after another. He developed a reputation for being melancholy, quiet, a bit gloomy, which, shocker, happens when you're raised alone, sickly, and constantly reminded that your entire existence is one big fragile balancing act. But here's the kicker. João Manuel still had to fulfill his royal duty. That meant finding a bride. And in true dynastic fashion, his bride would be, you guessed it, another close relative. Let's float to Spain for a second. The Spanish crown at the time was ruled by Emperor Charles V, the big Habsburg himself, ruler of half of Europe and collector of more titles than anyone could realistically use. Charles had a daughter, Joanna of Spain, and guess who she was lined up to marry? Yup, our boy, João Manuel, the sickly prince in a cage. Because nothing screams strong political alliance than marrying off 2 fragile cousins in hopes that their combined genetics might, against all odds, produce a healthy heir. Spoiler, it did not. But let's drift into that sad little marriage later. For now, picture João at around age 14 or 15, pale, thin, looking more ghostly than regal. By this point, it was clear to everyone that he was not going to be the kind of monarch who led armies into battle. He could barely leave his chambers without risking collapse. And yet, the wheels of royal politics kept spinning. Portugal needed him alive, Spain needed the alliance, and João Manuel himself? Well, he was probably too sick to argue. So as we left João Manuel, our cage-bound, fragile prince was teetering through adolescence, more ghost than boy, quietly carrying the weight of an empire's hopes on his thin shoulders. But as always in royal history, the next step was marriage. Because what's a sickly prince for if not to cement alliances, produce heirs, and generally keep dynastic paperwork flowing? Enter Joanna of Spain, a Habsburg princess, daughter of Emperor Charles V, and, naturally, João's cousin. Because, again, why not keep the genes in the family and see if a little inbreeding magic can make an actual healthy royal? Spoiler, history tends to be a little bit crueler than that. Joanna was reportedly a strong-willed, serious girl. By strong-willed, I mean she probably could outsulk most of the Portuguese court while maintaining perfect posture, which might have been necessary because she was marrying a prince who, at the age of 16, looked like he'd been through a particularly rough ghost training program. The marriage itself was, predictably, a quiet affair. There were no sweeping celebrations in the streets, no jousts, no victorious fanfares, just the delicate, precise movements of 2 royal children fulfilling centuries of dynastic expectations. João Manuel barely had the strength to stand for long periods, And Joanna probably spent the ceremony wondering if she'd be stuck spending the rest of her life cohabiting with someone who might faint at dinner. And as it turns out, her worries were well-founded. João Manuel's health was precarious at best. He suffered from fever, weakness, and some sources suggest that he may have had diabetes, which in the 16th century was basically a death sentence waiting to happen. But, as always, duty called. And in royal terms, duty is really just a euphemism for, let's hope he survives long enough to sire an heir. Their domestic life, to the extent that one could call it that, was marked by this persistent fragility. João Manuel was confined, guarded, and treated almost like a living artifact. Joanna, meanwhile, became caretaker, nurse, and dutiful princess. She might have spent entire days coaxing him to eat, drink, or simply breathe, because even
It's worth pausing here to float gently through the emotional landscape. João Manuel's life is a study in contrasts. He was surrounded by opulence, palaces, tutors, nurses, attendants, and yet utterly constrained. He had power in theory, but almost none in practice. He fulfilled his duty to the crown, but at the cost of his health and, ultimately, his life. And that's a recurring theme in royal history, isn't it? The combination of genetic quirks, political necessity, and relentless expectation often created situations that were as tragic as they were absurd. A prince in a cage, living just long enough to ensure the continuation of a dynasty. It's the sort of historical detail that makes you both marvel at human resilience and shake your head at human folly. Now, while João Manuel himself passed away young, his son Sebastian would go on to lead Portugal down yet another bizarre and tragic path. But for the moment, let's drift back and linger on João Manuel, the fragile prince in a gilded cage, because his story, while short, is a perfect encapsulation of dynastic absurdity in 16th century Europe. Even in death, the irony was palpable. The prince who had lived in a cage, shielded from the world, whose every move was constrained by illness and overprotective caretakers, left behind a son who would eventually inherit a kingdom. João Manuel never ruled in the usual sense. He never held court, led armies, or signed treaties. And yet without him, Portugal's line of succession would have been in jeopardy. His life reminds us of the curious, sometimes cruel nature of monarchy. Survival is not always about strength, valor, or skill. Sometimes survival and legacy is about enduring just long enough to produce an heir. And in João Manuel's case, enduring meant living under a constant veil of precaution, isolation, and careful handling, like the rarest of museum artifacts. And, of course, the court moved on. Life, in royal terms, does not pause for grief. Officials continued plotting alliances, diplomats continued sending letters, and the empire kept functioning. João Manuel, the prince in a cage, was now part of history, a brief, fragile chapter whispered about in corridors and chronicled by scribes who could hardly capture the quiet tragedy of his life. So, João Manuel's life was brief, fragile, and confined, and then almost immediately, the focus shifts to his son. Little Sebastian inherited more than just the throne. He inherited a dynasty built on fragility, isolation, and sometimes questionable genetics, which, in retrospect, makes you wonder how anyone thought ruling Portugal would be simple. Sebastian was born in 1554, a year after João Manuel's death. Imagine being born into a world where your father had barely lived long enough to hold you, and yet everyone already expected you to carry the weight of an empire. That was Sebastian's life from day one. No pressure, right? As a child, his upbringing was heavily influenced by the memory of his father. João Manuel, the frail prince who lived in a cage, had set an example, albeit a tragic one, of how little control an heir sometimes has over his own destiny. Sebastian's tutors, nurses, and advisors likely treated him with a mixture of awe, caution, and mild panic.
After all, if the previous generation could barely survive adolescence, how could this one possibly fare? The boy grew up surrounded by the trappings of royalty, palaces, ornate gowns, a carefully managed diet, and, of course, constant supervision. Yet the shadow of fragility hung over him. The Portuguese court, ever aware of the dangers of dynastic weakness, was determined that Sebastian would be a strong, capable king, something his father never really had the chance to become. Interestingly, Sebastian developed a reputation for being vigorous and energetic, the exact opposite of his father. He loved riding horses, practicing military drills, and throwing himself into grand schemes. Some historians speculate that this overcompensation was partly because he wanted to distance himself from the image of his sickly father. But here's the subtle irony. All that energy and ambition would eventually lead him into deeply unfortunate decisions later in life. Back to João Manuel for a moment. Though his life was short, his confinement, frailty, and premature death became a kind of cautionary tale for the Portuguese court. Advisors constantly reminded young Sebastian, "Your father didn't last long. You must be stronger, wiser, and more careful." And Sebastian, naturally, took this advice in his own way, which often leaned toward reckless rather than cautious. It's worth noting the psychological weight that João Manuel's life imposed. Even though Sebastian never met his father, he was too young. The stories of the prince in a cage would have been whispered in corridors, recounted by servants, and mentioned during lessons on royal duty. This created a subtle, persistent anxiety, the ever-present fear that fragility, illness, or dynastic misfortune could strike at any moment. By the time Sebastian reached adolescence, the Portuguese court was already plotting the future. Marriages, alliances, treaties, all designed to prevent the sort of disaster that had struck João Manuel. Yet human nature being what it is, these plans often had the opposite effect. Sebastian's youthful energy and desire for glory didn't always align with the measured prudence his father's life had exemplified. Now, let's drift back to João Manuel for a moment, because his life, though brief, was a curious combination of isolation and influence. He never ruled, never held court, and probably never signed a treaty. And yet, in a way, his very fragility shaped history. By surviving long enough to produce Sebastian, João Manuel ensured the continuation of the Aves dynasty, but also, unintentionally, set the stage for future turmoil. Sebastian's story, in a way, can be seen as a direct response to his father's limitations. Where João Manuel was cautious, weak, and confined, Sebastian was bold, vigorous, and occasionally reckless. The contrast is striking, and it's a reminder of how dynastic history often unfolds. One generation suffers quietly in a gilded cage, the next generation throws open the doors and charges forward, sometimes into disaster. Floating gently into the broader context, Portugal itself was at an interesting point in history. The empire was wealthy, expansive, and influential. Portuguese ships carried spices, gold, and sugar across the globe. And yet at home, the royal family was a precarious experiment in human fragility. One sickly prince or one overambitious young king could change the course of the nation. Which is exactly what happened. João Manuel's confinement, illness, and early death created a vacuum of experience and guidance for Sebastian. There was no fatherly mentor to caution him, no living example of what happens when ambition meets vulnerability. And as we'll see in the next part, Sebastian's energetic, overconfident approach to kingship would have lasting consequences for Portugal. But before we drift into that tale, let's linger on João Manuel one last time. There's something quietly remarkable about a life so brief and constrained, yet so crucial. He never rode horses, never led armies, never entertained the court with witty banter. He lived in a cage, protected by attendants, and yet managed to shape history simply by existing long enough to have a child. And that, in a sleepy, ironic sort of way, is the essence of his story. The fragility of one prince, confined and sheltered,
became the foundation upon which Portugal's next generation of rulers would be built and eventually tested. João Manuel may have been a minor footnote in the grand narrative of European royalty, but his life embodies the strange, quiet tragedies that often unfold behind palace walls.
So here we are, comfortably nestled in the aftermath of João Manuel's short, cage-bound life. His son, Sebastian, is now king, not by choice, but by the relentless machinery of dynastic necessity. Born into a world where one weak prince could almost derail an entire kingdom, Sebastian carried both the promise and the silent warnings of his father's story. Imagine being a young boy, perhaps 10 or 12, in a palace where your father had barely survived childhood. The whispers would be everywhere. Remember João Manuel. Be strong. Do not falter. And yet, the psychological inheritance wasn't just caution. It was a sort of pressure cooker, the fragile past pushing the next generation toward extremes. Sebastian, energetic and ambitious, internalized the fear of weakness, but in doing so, developed a kind of restless audacity. By the time he officially assumed the throne in 1568, he was only 14 years old. The court had long prepared for this transition. Advisors, tutors, and regents guided the young king through the formalities of rulership. But the irony, gentle and persistent, was that João Manuel's confinement had left a vacuum of example. Sebastian had no fatherly precedent for patience, prudence, or managing the burdens of sovereignty. And so he ruled with youthful enthusiasm, sometimes bordering on recklessness. Whereas João Manuel had been cautious, by necessity, Sebastian's approach was to act boldly. Military campaigns, ambitious foreign policies, and a desire to leave a mark on history all drove him forward. There was almost a symbolic reversal here. Where one generation had been imprisoned by fragility, the next seemed determined to burst out of the palace walls entirely. Yet, the shadow of João Manuel's life lingered. The court constantly reminded Sebastian of the precariousness of life, the dangers of overreaching, and the fragility of royal blood. These reminders were part guidance, part anxiety management. After all, if a single sickly prince could cause such concern, how much more important was it to ensure that a vigorous young king did not endanger the empire? Sebastian's reign was marked by a curious combination of energy and misfortune. On one hand, he inspired loyalty and admiration. He rode horses, trained soldiers, and pursued his ideals with almost romantic zeal. On the other hand, he occasionally ignored practical advice, a foreshadowing of the kind of consequences dynastic families often face when ambition outruns caution. And subtly, one can see echoes of João Manuel's life in Sebastian's story. The overprotection and concern that had defined his father's existence now transformed into overconfidence and desire to assert control. It's almost poetic. The cage of the past becomes the daring of the present. History, it seems, has a gentle sense of irony. Of course, Sebastian's story also reminds us of how fragile dynasties can be. João Manuel's brief life, confined and sheltered, had ensured the continuation of the Ivy's line, but it also left little room for guidance or mentorship. Sebastian, ambitious and energetic, ultimately faced challenges that required more than youthful vigor. And in royal families, the transition from a fragile parent to an audacious child is rarely smooth. Portugal itself was a thriving empire, wealthy and influential, yet vulnerable. Overseas colonies, trade networks, and alliances made the nation powerful but also dependent on careful leadership. A single misstep, a poorly timed campaign, or a misguided alliance could have far-reaching consequences. Sebastian, by his nature, was more inclined to boldness than caution, a fact that would shape Portugal's history in unexpected ways. Yet for now, let's linger gently on João Manuel's quiet legacy. His life may have been brief, but it had a ripple effect. By surviving long enough to produce Sebastian, he ensured that the dynasty continued. By living in a cage, he set an invisible benchmark of caution and fragility. By dying young, he created space for audacity, ambition, and eventual recklessness in the next generation. This interplay between fragility and ambition, caution and boldness, is what makes João Manuel's story quietly compelling. He may never have led armies, enacted policies, or participated in courtly intrigue in any meaningful way. Yet his very existence, fragile, confined, fleeting, shaped the psychological and political landscape of Portugal for decades. And so, as we float gently toward the next chapter, consider this. The story of a single, frail prince in a cage is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a lens through which we can see the delicate balance of dynastic power, the irony of inherited fragility, and the ways in which even the quietest lives can leave a lasting imprint on history. Sebastian's life, energetic and ultimately tragic, is a continuation of João Manuel's story. And in many ways, it's a reminder that the legacies of the past are not always obvious. Sometimes they whisper through the palace corridors, guide youthful decisions, and subtly shape the course of nations, even when the person who began it all was never strong enough to lead.